The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's ER in Savannah hum at precisely 3:53 a.m., a frequency that never quite sounds like anything alive. Sarah Chen moves between bays with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory, 15 years of night shifts compressed into something that looks effortless but costs everything. Her hands are steady as surgical steel despite the tremor most night shift nurses develop after a decade in this particular fluorescent hell. She wears long sleeves even in July heat, the Savannah air thick enough to drink, but the scars underneath need to stay invisible. To anyone who knows combat wounds, those scars tell a story the hospital administration must never read. The intercom crackles once, twice, then falls silent again. Bay 7. Trauma incoming. Deaf male, late 20s, stable vitals but altered mental status, ETA for minutes. Sarah doesn't move faster. Moving faster means emotion. Moving faster means engagement. Moving faster means mistakes. She finishes charting on her current patient, a 73-year-old with stable chest pain who will survive the night, and she wheels toward the trauma bay with her badge clipped precisely at her collarbone, her name tag reading Chen, RN in deliberately small letters that no one ever reads carefully enough to notice the credentials beneath it. The paramedics arrive with bay doors slamming and the familiar percussion of professional urgency. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The ambulance crew moves like water around obstacles they've learned to anticipate. The patient is wrapped in a transport blanket, his face turned slightly away, his hands moving with frantic precision through shapes and angles that most of the ER nurses mistake for seizure activity rather than what it actually is, sign language. Desperate, rapid, the kind of signing that comes from someone trying to communicate something critical and watching everyone fail to understand. Sarah sees him and stops. Just for a microsecond. Her jaw tightens, that subtle flexing beneath the skin that happens when a memory hits so hard it tries to physically escape. Trauma to 7, the paramedic says, reading vitals with the practice monotone of someone who said these things 5,000 times. 28-year-old male, IED blast injury left ear, profound hearing loss, no recent trauma but patient is extremely agitated, possible PTSD episode, responsive to visual stimuli only, vital stable, BP 118/72, heart rate 88, O2 sat 98 on room air, GCS 15. The ER nurses begin their routine. For position check. Monitor leads applied. Blood pressure cuff repositioned. The choreography of people who have never once looked at the person beneath the clinical data. Sarah steps into the bay and signs. Fluid. Precise. The kind of American sign language that comes from active use, not textbook learning. You're safe. I'm a nurse. What's your name? The young man's head snaps toward her. For the first time since the ambulance doors opened, his hands still. His eyes, dark brown, carrying the weight of whatever happened in the fraction of a second that an IED takes to decide whether someone lives or dies, lock onto hers with the kind of recognition that stops time for a beat. He signs back slowly, as if she might be a hallucination. Marcus. Marcus Webb. I'm looking for someone. From a long time ago. Before this. He touches his left ear, and his face does something complicated that isn't quite anger and isn't quite grief. Sarah's hands continue their work, for catheter secured, fluids running, the mechanical poetry of emergency nursing, but something in her chest shifts. Settles. Like a bone that's been dislocated for 20 years finally sliding back into place. We'll help you find who you're looking for, she signs. Right now, let's make sure you're okay. Marcus reaches into his pocket, movements careful because he's learned what hospital security looks like when they get nervous. His fingers close around something small and metal, tarnished the color of old pennies and older wars. He presses it into her palm with the weight of evidence, of proof, of something he's carried for 2 decades the way some people carry prayers. A military challenge coin. The edges worn smooth from repeated handling. One side stamped with a call sign that makes Sarah's entire nervous system recognize itself, Nightingale 6. Beneath it, a date. Tikrit. 2004. She doesn't react. The coin sits in her palm like a trigger she's disarmed by refusing to flinch. Her hands complete the vital signs assessment, her voice when she speaks, everything looks good, Marcus, you're stable, carries the exact same steady measure it would use on any patient. This is what 15 years of invisible service looks like, the ability to hold a piece of your own shattered history and keep taking blood pressure readings like your hands belong to someone else entirely. You know that coin. Marcus signs, his eyes moving from her face to her hands and back again, searching for the confirmation that might explain how a person survives 2 decades looking for someone they never even saw clearly, just felt in the dark, a presence that meant safety, meant survival, meant Nightingale 6 was real. I know of it, Sarah signs back. Just that. Just enough truth to not be a lie. Stay with us tonight. Let's get you stable first. Dr. Whitfield enters the bay at 3:52 a.m., his white coat crisp enough to cut glass, his attention already on his phone, a message from the billing contractor that mentioned some discrepancies he'd need to address before the state auditor's office started asking questions in the new fiscal year. He glances at the patient. He notes the extended observation Sarah has already recommended for neurological monitoring. He files this information somewhere in the part of his mind that calculates threats and opportunities with equal precision. What Whitfield sees is a non-critical patient receiving more attention than insurance protocols typically allow. What he calculates is that Sarah Chen, the invisible night shift nurse who never asks questions, who keeps her head down, who wears humility like it's part of her uniform, represents the single greatest threat to 3 years of carefully constructed financial arrangements. Extended observation means extended documentation. Extended documentation means auditable records. Auditable records, with someone actually paying attention to billing practices, means the entire scheme becomes visible to exactly the wrong people. His eyes narrow. Not dramatically. Just a tightening at the corners, the way predators assess whether something is prey or potential competition. Deaf veteran, he asks, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone for whom compassion is a performance rather than a native language. Extended observation seems optimistic given his vitals. He's stable. Sarah continues her assessment, her hands moving with the precision of someone who understands that her response happens through action, not argument. Profound hearing loss from IED blast. No baseline hearing capability. Needs neurological monitoring and audiology consultation to establish baseline cognitive function without auditory input. Could indicate central processing damage. It's correct. It's evidence-based. It's also extended hospital stay billing. Whitfield's jaw does something subtle, and Sarah doesn't need to look at him to know what that means. She spent 15 years reading institutional power dynamics the way other people read email. He moves to the patient, performs his own neurological assessment, thorough, competent, efficient, and his voice when he emerges from the clinical sequence carries a particular tone. 24-hour observation. Neurology consult in the morning if his mental status changes. Otherwise, standard discharge tomorrow pending audiology. Sarah nods. Just that. Just the acknowledgement of someone receiving orders from someone with institutional authority. But later, at 4:15 a.m., when Whitfield stands by the medication dispensary charting notes on his laptop, his voice carries a comment to the resident rotating through nights, a comment delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that only works when the target isn't present to defend herself. Chen's getting emotionally invested in that patient, he says, his fingers still moving across the keyboard, his tone suggesting this is clinical observation rather than what it actually is, the opening move of someone consolidating power through strategic humiliation. That's the problem with night shift nursing. Too much time alone with patients, too little supervision. It compromises judgment. These extended observations, these extra interventions, they're not evidence-based anymore. They're emotional. The resident, a third-year med student named Patterson, nervous and eager to seem experienced, nods in a way that suggests he's absorbing this as teaching rather than recognizing it as something far more dangerous. Can't afford to let compassion override hospital economics, Whitfield continues, closing his laptop with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully planted a seed of doubt in someone else's mind. She's a good nurse, but she's too attached to her charity cases to understand how this institution actually stays solvent. The words sit in the fluorescent-lit silence like poison in still water. Not even loud enough to be called to account. Just loud enough to reach Sarah through the open door of Bay 7, where she's documenting Marcus's mental status while he sleeps, his hand still curled around the place where the challenge coin had been before he'd pressed it into her palm as if it might be the only evidence anyone would ever believe. She doesn't react. Her hands continue their work. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her eyes don't find Whitfield's with the kind of recognition that would confirm he'd successfully wounded her. This is what 15 years of military medical service teaches you, that restraint is its own form of authority, that composure under pressure is a weapon they can't defend against because they don't recognize it as a weapon at all. They see it as acceptance. Resignation. The natural posture of someone without options. Sarah signs to Marcus once more before she completes her documentation. Sleep now. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. He sleeps. And she continues her work, moving between patients with the invisible efficiency that had kept her alive through Tikrit, through a classified operation that officially never happened, through 20 years of becoming someone even she sometimes forgot she used to be. But what neither of them understood, sitting in that bay at 4:17 a.m. with a challenge coin carried in Sarah's pocket like a piece of evidence slowly accumulating weight, was that Whitfield had just made his first calculated move. Not his most desperate one. Not his most dangerous one. Just the first. Thursday morning arrived with fluorescent brightness and the smell of industrial coffee brewing in the physician's lounge. Dr. Whitfield stood before 30 medical residents arranged in tiered seating like a courtroom, his voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The projection screen behind him displayed Marcus Webb's chart in clinical blue and white, vitals, admission notes, the photograph of a young man with intelligent eyes and hearing aids visible in both ears. This case represents a teaching opportunity, Whitfield announced, gesturing with theatrical slowness. Specifically, the dangers of emotional over-involvement compromising clinical judgment. Sarah stood at the back wall, hands clasped behind her back, her posture carrying the kind of stillness that suggested she'd been standing watch in harder places than a hospital conference room. Whitfield continued, his tone dripping with condescension. Our patient presented with mild vertigo and anxiety, conditions typically resolved within 24 to 48 hours with standard observation and vestibular rehabilitation. He paused, letting the residents absorb this before his voice sharpened. Yet Nurse Chen has maintained this patient for 72 hours based on what I can only describe as maternal instinct rather than medical necessity. 2 residents in the third row exchanged glances and smirked. One whispered something to his neighbor. Whitfield noticed the reaction and smiled, the smile of a man who learned that mockery spreads fastest when leadership fertilizes it first. The charity case collector, Whitfield said, turning the phrase over like he was unveiling a new diagnosis. That's what I've observed. A pattern of emotional attachment to patients from lower socio-economic brackets, creating extended hospital stays that cost St. Michael's approximately $8,000 per emotional involvement. He gestured again toward the screen, toward Marcus's name. The data doesn't lie. Neither do the economics. This hospital operates on a margin of 4%. Each unnecessary day of observation erodes that margin by 0.03%. Multiply that across a year, and you understand why some nurses create problems rather than solve them. Sarah's jaw tightened once, a single muscle spasm lasting perhaps 200 milliseconds. Her eyes remained fixed on Marcus's vitals displayed on the screen. She did not look at Whitfield. She did not look at the residents who were now taking notes, cementing this narrative into their understanding of what nurse behavior looked like when it crossed professional boundaries into pathology. Her hands remained perfectly steady, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. What they didn't know was that Sarah had stood in operating tents in the Jolan district of Fallujah while mortar rounds shook the canvas and doctors operated by generator light, and the concept of emotional involvement was a luxury no one carried into that kind of work. Emotional involvement got people killed. It clouded judgment. It made you hesitate when hesitation meant death. She'd learned to separate the human being from the body she was treating, to see patients as problems to solve rather than stories that mattered. But standing in this conference room, watching 30 residents absorb the message that caring too much was a character flaw, something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The grand rounds continued for another 17 minutes. Whitfield discussed the appropriate length of stay for vestibular disorders, cited 3 studies about unnecessary hospitalization, and managed to mention Sarah's name 3 more times in contexts designed to suggest a pattern of poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. When the session ended, residents filtered out in clusters, already discussing the case, the narrative settling into their minds like sediment in still water. Tuesday afternoon, 4th floor, vending machines. Sarah inserted $2 bills to retrieve a black coffee she didn't particularly want but needed an excuse to move away from her station for 90 seconds. Whitfield stood nearby with 3 billing administrators, their conversation happening at normal volume but angled precisely so she would hear it. Some people are too emotionally compromised to understand hospital economics, he said, studying his phone rather than speaking to her directly. They see patients as stories rather than line items. They create expenses based on feelings rather than protocols. One of the billing administrators, a woman named Patricia with 17 years of experience, shifted uncomfortably. The other 2 nodded. These individuals, Whitfield continued, mean well, of course. But good intentions and financial solvency are not the same thing. Good intentions can bankrupt an institution. Sarah's hand remained perfectly steady as she added cream to her coffee, precisely 1 cup, the color shifting from black to medium brown. She stirred once. Her face showed nothing, not anger, not hurt, not the kind of shame that Whitfield clearly intended to inflict. She simply finished preparing her beverage and walked past the group, her shoulders straight, her stride even, moving through the hallway like she'd learned to move through hostile territory. The absence of any reaction seemed to frustrate Whitfield more than anger would have. Back in Marcus's room, she continued his care with the same precision she applied to everything, checking his oxygen saturation, reviewing his blood pressure logs, monitoring his hearing aids battery levels. She signed to him about his afternoon physical therapy schedule, her hands moving with the fluidity of someone for whom sign language was as natural as speech. Marcus watched her face carefully, the way he always did, his eyes asking questions his voice couldn't carry across the silence that encased him. But that wasn't the worst part. That came Tuesday evening when Sarah submitted routine billing discrepancy reports to patient advocacy, standard protocol she followed with every extended stay patient, the kind of documentation that protected both the hospital and individual patients from fraudulent charges. She'd noticed patterns in Marcus's billing that didn't align with his actual procedures. 3 procedures billed that she'd never witnessed. Supplies charged that hadn't been used. The amounts were small enough to escape most notice, but Sarah had been trained to see patterns the way other people saw colors, they simply registered as data points that didn't belong. Whitfield intercepted her outside the records room, his jaw set, his face the color of raw salmon. He stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively woody that seemed designed to announce his presence. "If you continue to waste administrative resources questioning my clinical judgment," he said, his voice low but carrying the kind of controlled fury that often precedes consequences, "I'll have security escort you out of this facility and file formal complaints with the state nursing board regarding medication errors." He paused, letting that sink in. "Do you understand what that means for your career?" Sarah met his eyes directly. Her expression remained neutral. She nodded once, a small downward tilt of her head, and walked past him down the hallway toward Marcus's room. Behind her, she heard him breathing heavily, the sound of a man discovering that his weapon wasn't working the way he'd anticipated. In Marcus's room, she checked his vitals with hands that showed no tremor whatsoever. Blood pressure 120/78. Heart rate stable at 64. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. She documented everything in his chart with a kind of meticulous accuracy that left no room for error, no room for misinterpretation, every number and note positioned to survive scrutiny. She signed to Marcus about dinner options, whether he preferred the grilled chicken or the baked salmon, her hands moving with complete steadiness even though somewhere deep in the parts of her she'd learned to compartmentalize, the recognition was forming that Whitfield had moved from social attacks into something more strategic. He was activating networks. He was going to make phone calls. He was going to build a case. Rubber gloves snapped as she changed them between patients, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet of the late afternoon. She moved between rooms with the same efficiency she'd learned in field hospitals, where wasted motion could cost lives and economy of movement was itself a form of respect. Marcus watched her from his bed, his intelligent eyes tracking her movements, seeing something in her posture that suggested a burden he recognized but couldn't quite identify. That evening, after her shift technically ended at 11 p.m., she sat with Marcus in his darkened room, the city lights of Savannah visible through the window, the hallway outside quiet except for the distant sound of a monitor beeping somewhere 3 rooms down. Marcus showed her the challenge coin again, turning it slowly in his palm so the lamplight caught the engraving. His hands began signing before she could stop him. I was 7 years old in Tikrit, mortar fire. American nurse carried me 6 miles through enemy fire, gave me this coin, told me to be brave, then vanished like a ghost. Sarah's hands paused for 3 full seconds, the longest hesitation anyone had witnessed from her, before she responded. Her signing was precise, her fingers spelling out each concept with the clarity of someone accustomed to being understood. Some soldiers disappear because they were ordered to, because operations get buried, because officially they never existed. Marcus's hand reached out and gently grasped her wrist, the one she always kept covered. He turned it slowly, revealing the shrapnel scar pattern running like a constellation across her skin, old marks, decades old, shaped exactly like the fragmentation pattern she'd taken intended for a 7-year-old boy. His eyes widened. His hand began to tremble. He started signing frantically, words spilling from his fingers too quickly for her to interrupt. Sarah shook her head once, firmly, pulling her wrist away. "I'm just a night shift nurse. Whoever saved you was someone else, from a life that doesn't exist in any records." But Marcus was already reaching for his phone, already typing, already searching for classified operations, Tikrit 2004, medical personnel, special forces attachments, finding only redacted documents and officially denied missions and a wall of silence that somehow confirmed everything his instincts had been telling him for 3 days. The dispatch radio crackled at 2:07 a.m. 6-vehicle pileup on I-95 northbound, just past exit 44. 2 semis, for passenger vehicles. Multiple entrapments. Unknown number of critical patients. ETA to St. Michael's, for minutes. Sarah was restocking the supply cart in Bay 2 when she heard it. The other nurses froze for a moment, that familiar hesitation before the chaos. She didn't hesitate. She moved, her body already shifting into a rhythm her conscious mind had unconsciously chosen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she turned to face the charge nurse. "Bay placement." Sarah's voice was different now. Clipped. Precise. An instrument. "We're assuming at least for critical," the charge nurse stammered. "Maybe more. Set up bays 1, 3, and 4 for trauma. Full setup. 2 gurneys each in the waiting area. Get maintenance to prop both ER doors open, full width. I need for stand stationed at every entrance, so we're not wasting 30 seconds looking for them. Call respiratory and tell them we're going all hands active. Now." The charge nurse nodded and moved. Sarah's hands were already pulling additional trauma trays from the locked cabinet, 14-gauge angiocatheters, chest tubes, thoracic instruments. Her movements had a fluidity to them that suggested this wasn't her first mass casualty situation. It wasn't even close. The waiting room would fill first. Always does. The worried relatives, the confused patients who didn't need the ER but thought they might. Sarah mentally relocated them without a word, simply understanding the choreography of disaster. Gurneys appeared. Monitors were positioned. Blood products were ordered up from downstairs. 8 units of O-negative on standby. 2 units of fresh frozen plasma. The rhythm of it all was almost musical if you'd ever lived inside this particular symphony. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 2:14 a.m., still knotting his tie in the hallway, his face flushed with the particular irritation of a man whose sleep had been interrupted. He glanced around the transformed ER and frowned. "This is premature," he said to nobody in particular. "We don't even know if they're critical yet." Sarah didn't respond. She was already checking the defibrillator pads, already ensuring the crash carts had been restocked from the previous shift. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested she'd learned long ago that some people didn't need to be argued with. They needed to be worked around. The ambulances began arriving at 2:19 a.m. Two critical at the same moment, both screaming in through the bay doors like wounded animals. Sarah moved into Bay 1, her scrubs already covered with a trauma gown as the first patient, a 40-something man with a shattered femur, was rushed through. His thigh was wrapped in a field tourniquet, blood already pooling on the gurney. The paramedic was calling out vitals with the clipped precision of someone who'd done this 100 times. 52-year-old male, vehicle 2, crush injury to left lower extremity, blood loss estimated 2 liters pre-hospital, BP 88/54 and dropping, heart rate 128, respiratory distress secondary to pain. Bay 3 filled next. A woman with a head laceration that wouldn't stop bleeding, a child with an obvious arm fracture screaming for their mother, and then the worst one came through. Bay 4. An 18-year-old girl, conscious but barely. The steering column had punched through her chest at an angle, still embedded. Her shirt was soaked red. Her lips were already taking on a blue tint. Her eyes were wide and locked in the particular terror of someone whose body was telling her that something catastrophic had shifted inside. Dr. Whitfield entered Bay 4 behind the paramedic. Sarah could see it happen from across the room, the moment he understood what he was looking at. His hands came up. They began to shake. "Steering column penetrating trauma," the paramedic was saying. "Vitals at scene were stable, but we saw distended neck veins en route, muffled heart sounds developing. Pressures dropping. We think cardiac tamponade." Whitfield's face went the particular shade of grey that Sarah had learned to recognize. Not fear. Fear was useful. This was something else. This was the look of a man who'd built an entire career on competence he didn't actually possess, and the mask was cracking. "Get her to the OR," Whitfield said. His voice cracked slightly. "Call cardiothoracic immediately. We need surgery." "ETA on CT," the charge nurse asked. 30 minutes. "They're in another procedure." "We're first call, but..." The girl's monitor changed. The rhythm flattened. Not completely. Not yet. But trending wrong. Blood pressure 72/40. Whitfield's hands were shaking visibly now. He reached for the girl's wrist, then let his hand drop. Sarah was already moving. She pulled on a trauma gown in one fluid motion, already gloved, already prepped. She'd moved through the ER like water finding its path, and now she was in Bay 4, and everything else, the chaos, the other patients, the noise, was already filtered out. "Call for thoracic tray," she said. Not asked. "I need chest access. Now." Whitfield looked at her. His eyes had a quality of panic in them that made him look smaller. "You can't. You're not authorized. We need to wait for surgery. That's protocol. You're a nurse, you can't." Sarah was already prepping the field, already swabbing the girl's chest with betadine, her movements carrying the terrible precision of someone who'd performed this procedure under conditions significantly worse than a well-lit American hospital. Her hands had done this in dust storms. Her hands had done this on floors slick with blood that wasn't quite dry. Her hands knew the exact angle, the exact pressure, the exact moment when bone gave way. "Step back or assist, doctor," she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't louder. But it carried a quality that made Whitfield's feet physically move backward, away from the table, away from the sterile field, away from Sarah and her impossible competence. The scalpel moved. Once. Precisely. The sternum cracked with an audible sound, a wet, sharp snapping that made 3 of the junior residents inhale sharply. Sarah's hands were inside the chest cavity now, fingers finding the pericardium, feeling for the fluid that was suffocating the girl's heart. The fluid released like a sigh, dark blood draining from around the cardiac muscle. Direct cardiac massage, Sarah called out. Not to Whitfield. To the room. To anyone who could help. Prepare for transport to OR. Get me 2 units of O-negative running wide open. EKG up. I need continuous monitoring. Her hand was on the girl's heart now. Actually on it. Feeling it. The muscle beneath her palm was weak, struggling, like a bird with broken wings. Sarah's fingers moved with a rhythm that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with knowledge. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. Not frantic. Methodical. The rhythm of someone who understood that hearts were muscle, and muscle was physics, and physics was the only thing that could save lives when everything else had failed. The monitor began to change. The flat line became a whisper. Then a beat. Then a rhythm. Pressure started climbing. 65, 72. 80, the color began to return to the girl's lips. Whitfield stood frozen in the corner, watching Sarah perform open-chest cardiac massage on a teenager like she was adjusting full lines. His hands had stopped shaking only because they'd gone numb. The cardiothoracic surgeon arrived 23 minutes later and took over, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of a nurse with her hand inside a patient's chest, maintaining circulation with a precision that suggested she'd received training he'd only read about in textbooks marked classified. Sarah stepped back smoothly, stripped off her gloves, hand steady, no tremor, no hesitation, and handed over the case with a 2-sentence handoff that included everything the surgeon needed and nothing he didn't. The girl would make it to the OR. She would live. Sarah somehow already knew this before the monitor confirmed it. Across the hall, Marcus Webb watched the entire thing from his hospital bed, his eyes fixed on the small Filipino woman in blood-soaked scrubs who'd just performed open-heart surgery with her bare hands. He understood, in that moment, that he'd been right all along. And that the woman who'd carried him through mortar fire in a place called Tikrit was standing 40 feet away, still saving lives, still doing the work that the government had officially decided never happened. Whitfield's office occupied the corner of St. Michael's administrative level, all mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Savannah's moss-draped oaks. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. The room contained 4 people arranged in a semicircle of intention, Dr. Whitfield behind his desk, the HR investigator from the outside firm to his right with a leather portfolio, the hospital chief of staff looking uncomfortable in the middle chair, and the board president who had cut short his weekend golf game, his polo shirt still bearing the grass stains of impatience. Sarah wasn't there yet. Whitfield had spent Friday night building his case with the precision of a man constructing a house of cards that had to hold just long enough. His hands arranged the paperwork in front of him, fabricated incident reports, billing complaints reframed as insubordination, and a single blank line where her background verification should have been. The narrative was elegant: unauthorized procedures, scope creep, credential gaps, liability nightmare. The woman performed surgical intervention without physician authorization, Whitfield began, his voice carrying the tone of someone discussing a disease he'd diagnosed. Emergency open-chest cardiac massage. That's not in her scope of practice. That's not in her job description. That's not, he paused, letting the silence matter, that's not legal. The HR investigator, a woman named Patterson with the detached efficiency of someone who terminated 300 people for 300 different reasons, made a note. The emergency protocols allow her to call for a surgeon, Whitfield interrupted, smooth as silk. Not to become one. Furthermore, he slid across a folder, my investigation reveals troubling gaps in her background verification. Her employment history before St. Michael's shows inconsistencies. I have her listed as a staff nurse at Seattle General from 2003 to 2008, but those records are sparse. Sparse, Ms. Patterson. A 14-year gap follows. She materialized at this hospital in 2018 with documentation that, upon closer inspection, contains date discrepancies in her credentialing paperwork. The chief of staff shifted. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting credential fabrication isn't a small thing, Whitfield continued, his face arranging itself into the expression of a man deeply troubled by professional malfeasance. Additionally, she has actively undermined physician authority by filing frivolous billing complaints with patient advocacy. Yesterday morning, she flagged billing discrepancies in this patient's chart. He gestured with the Marcus Webb file as though it were evidence of infection. She has questioned my medical judgment repeatedly. Implied, through her actions, that I am engaged in improper billing practices. The board president's jaw tightened. Is there any substance to those complaints? None whatsoever, Whitfield said, his voice carrying absolute confidence. But the mere filing of such complaints, the mere act of creating a paper trail suggesting impropriety where none exists, creates liability exposure for this institution. And that exposure compounds when the nurse making those complaints has fabricated credentials. The HR investigator opened her portfolio. The State Nursing Board has received concerns about her credentials. Anonymous referral, filed Friday afternoon. The Chief of Staff looked at the board president. The board president looked at the documents. Nobody looked at the empty chair where Sarah wasn't sitting yet. By Friday afternoon, Sarah had been summoned to the HR office on the 3rd floor. The notification was clinical, a printed email requesting her presence at 3:41 p.m., delivered to her locker by a security guard whose eyes wouldn't meet hers. She changed from her scrubs in the nurse's locker room, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone undressing a uniform for the last time, though she didn't know it yet. The scrubs went into her personal locker. She replaced them with the clothes she'd worn that morning, jeans, a grey cardigan, boots that had walked through 5 countries whose names she couldn't speak aloud. The HR office smelled of hand sanitizer and paper. Patterson sat across from her at a conference table. The Chief of Staff stood by the window. A suspension notice lay centered on the table between them, its language precise and devoid of mercy, pending investigation, unauthorized procedures, credential discrepancies, recommend immediate surrender of hospital credentials. You are suspended effective immediately, Patterson said, her voice the texture of wet cement. Badge, keys, access cards. Security will escort you from the building. Sarah nodded once. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply signed the papers where indicated, her signature the same as it had been for the last 15 years, clean, economical, the signature of someone used to signing things that meant things. The security desk occupied the lobby floor. Old Tom Rodriguez manned it, the veteran guard whose chest bore the barely visible outline of a Purple Heart he never mentioned. His eyes went soft when he saw her approaching with the credentials in her hands. She placed her badge on the counter. The ID photograph showed her 15 years younger, her face still learning how to be unremarkable. Beneath it, the badge number that had opened every door in this hospital. Beside it, her key ring, 3 keys for the staff areas, 1 for the medication closet, 1 for the narcotics cabinet. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he recorded the surrender in his ledger. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But his eyes tracked her to the exit, and she felt his salute more than saw it, the old gesture from someone who recognized another old gesture when it walked past. Dr. Whitfield watched from the 2nd floor window. His face showed the expression of a man whose calculated risk had paid dividends. Barely concealed satisfaction. The expression of someone who had removed a problem. His fingers traced the edge of his desk, and he checked his watch, 3:54 p.m. By Monday morning, if everything proceeded as planned, there would be no appeals, no investigation that found in Sarah's favor, no resurrection of this particular nurse. Down on the 3rd floor ICU, Marcus Webb watched from his hospital bed. His eyes had tracked every movement, Sarah's walk into HR, her emergence 14 minutes later without the badge, her descent toward the security desk. He understood the gesture for what it was, surrender. Sarah signed to him as she passed. Her hands moving in the gesture language they shared, not spoken, not written, but somehow the only true language available to her. Some wars can't be won. Be safe. Be brave. Marcus pressed the tarnished challenge coin into her palm as she passed his bed. The coin that bore her call sign engraved in letters so small they were almost whispers, Nightingale 6. She touched it once, her thumb running across the raised letters like they were braille, like she was reading her own name in a language she'd stopped speaking 2 decades ago. She pressed the coin back into his hand. "Keep this. I don't need it anymore." But that wasn't true. She needed it more than anything else she owned. Keeping it was the only thing that would prove this was real, that the person she had been was real, that the 7-year-old boy she'd carried through mortar fire had grown into this man who now understood exactly who she was. Sarah drove home in silence. The car ride from St. Michael's to her house on Magnolia Street took 14 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't call anyone. She simply drove through Savannah's Saturday afternoon traffic with the composure of someone whose life had just fractured into a before and an after, but whose face would never show it to anyone who might be watching. At 4 p.m., a time she was never, ever home, Sarah sat at her kitchen table still wearing her scrubs. She had forgotten to change. The cotton still held the smell of the hospital, antiseptic and plastic, and the copper penny scent of blood that had dried beneath her fingernails. She stared at her hands. These hands had held lives together. These hands had performed surgical procedures under conditions far worse than any hospital could create. These hands were the best thing she'd ever given to this world. Her 12-year-old daughter, Emma, came home from her friend's house at 4:13 p.m. She always came home at 4:13 p.m. on Saturdays. She opened the front door and made the kind of noise children make when they're home, calling Mom, with the casualness of someone who expected to find an empty house. She found her mother at the kitchen table instead. Found her still in scrubs. Found her crying, the first tears anyone had seen from Sarah Chen in approximately a decade. Emma froze in the kitchen doorway. The confusion on her face was the confusion of a child watching an immovable object move. "Mom." Sarah couldn't answer. "Mom, did you?" Emma's voice shifted into the register of genuine fear. "Did you get fired?" "Mom, what happened? Are we going to be okay?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. She couldn't speak words. Words belonged to a version of herself that had surrendered her identity at a security desk. Instead, her hands moved, signing against Emma's hair even though Emma didn't understand sign language, even though nobody was watching, even though the gesture meant nothing to anyone but herself. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I thought I could stay hidden." But you couldn't stay hidden. Not forever. The truth was a kind of gravity, it pulled at you long enough, and eventually, it brought you down. Sarah held her daughter in the kitchen of the house she'd bought with money from a job she'd just lost, and understood that she had just sacrificed the invisibility that had kept her safe for 20 years. She had stepped forward. And the world was about to step backward. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that stepping forward had already sent signals through channels that couldn't be stopped. A military prosecutor in Jacksonville had received a call about a routine employment termination at a civilian hospital. A Navy SEAL captain had seen a photograph flagged by an algorithm. A 2-star general had just received a file that had been classified as deceased since 2004. The silence at her kitchen table lasted until Monday morning, when the world stopped being quiet. Monday morning at 8:51 a.m., the world arrived in 3 Black Hawk helicopters. The rotor wash hit St. Michael's ER windows like artillery fire, rattling the blinds, shaking coffee cups off desks. Nurses stopped moving. Doctors looked up. The sound wasn't emergency, it was authority. It was the kind of arrival that made administrators sweat through their shirts. The military convoy moved through the parking lot with the fluid precision of people who'd done this before. Boots on asphalt. Purpose in every step. A Navy SEAL with a scarred face walked through the ER doors first, his presence changing the air pressure in the room like a storm front rolling in. Behind him came soldiers in dress uniforms, their medals catching fluorescent light like scattered fire. Behind them, a 2-star general whose chest was a gallery of valor, each ribbon earned in sand and blood and decisions that changed the shape of continents. They were looking for someone. Nightingale 6, the SEAL said. Not a request. It was a command wearing the shape of a question. Present yourself. The ER froze. Phone stopped ringing. The ventilator in Bay 3 wheezed its lonely rhythm while everyone held their breath. Sarah Chen was standing 7 feet away, checking vitals on a post-op cardiac patient. Her hands didn't pause. Her eyes didn't waver. She simply finished recording the blood pressure, 118/72, stable, and turned to face the SEAL with the calm of someone who'd been expecting this moment for 20 years. Marcus Webb stood at attention near the trauma station, his dress uniform crisp as folded paper, the tarnished challenge coin pressed into his palm like a prayer. When he saw her turn, he raised the coin high. Just high enough. Just enough light to catch it. The veteran security guard, a man named Clayton who'd carried a rifle in the Gulf, whose knees still ached with old shrapnel, stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, he said. Special Forces Medical. Navy Cross recipient. The room exhaled. Some people didn't understand the weight of those words. They would learn. The 2-star general stepped beside the SEAL, holding a folder thick with years. He opened it and began to read, his voice the color of authority, each word landing like a verdict. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. He paused. The general let that silence breathe. Silver Star for classified hostage extraction, Helmand Province, 2007. Another pause. Longer this time. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for fragmentation wounds sustained while shielding a non-combatant. 1 for 3rd-degree burns from IED blast proximity. The general looked up. His eyes found Sarah's across the empty space between them. And a Navy Cross. For actions in Tikrit, Iraq, 2004. 17 documented combat medical saves. 1 child extraction under fire. Citation marked declassified by Joint Special Operations Command. The words hung in the air like incense. Marcus moved forward, his movements controlled, deliberate. When he reached Sarah, he stopped exactly arm's length away. His hands began to move, fingers shaping sounds that had no voice, signing into the silence with the fluency of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to speak without words. The translator, a young army captain with ASL certification, spoke what Marcus's hands were saying. She carried me 6 miles through enemy fire when I was 7 years old. She took shrapnel meant for me. She held me and told me to be brave. Then she vanished. Command buried the entire operation. For 20 years, I searched for the woman who gave me this coin. Who told me her call sign was Nightingale 6? Who said if I was ever lost, to find someone who remembered that name? I spent 20 years finding my way back to her. Marcus opened his palm. The tarnished challenge coin lay there, catching light. Dr. Whitfield was standing near the X-ray station. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. His hands were shaking, not the tremor of age or fear, but something worse. The tremor of watching a structure you'd built with lies collapse in real time. Commander Patricia Hughes stood near the ER entrance, her uniform a map of her own service. She was a military prosecutor, retired 2 years, now consulting on federal fraud cases. She'd arrived yesterday with a folder that contained every billing record from Dr. Whitfield's 18 months at St. Michael's. She'd spread them across a conference table Sunday night. Phantom MRI charges. Specialist consultations that never happened. Procedures coded but never performed. Maxwell, the billing contractor, had already agreed to cooperate. 38% of fraudulent billings. $1.7 million. All of it documented. All of it damning. Whitfield's carefully constructed network had collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. The board president wasn't returning his calls. The state nursing board had confirmed Sarah Chen's credentials were not just legitimate, they were classified under federal protection. Her termination had violated federal statutes protecting covert military personnel in transition. His medical license was under emergency suspension as of 6 a.m. this morning. His employment termination would be signed by day's end. The two-star general folded the citation folder and handed it to Sarah. She took it without looking at it. Her eyes remained on Marcus, on the coin in his open palm, on the journey those hands had traveled through 20 years of searching. "Welcome home, Master Chief," the general said quietly. Sarah Chen nodded once. She didn't cry. She didn't embrace Marcus. She simply reached out and closed his fingers gently around the coin, then signed something the translator didn't translate. Whatever she said, Marcus understood. His shoulders straightened. His chin lifted. The lost boy became a soldier again, standing at attention beside the woman who'd saved him when she was someone else, in a country far away, in a moment that shouldn't have happened and officially never did. The military convoy withdrew as precisely as they'd arrived. The rotor wash rattled the windows one final time. The helicopters lifted into the savannah morning, carrying with them the weight of classified operations and hidden sacrifices and the kinds of heroism that don't appear in newspapers because they're not supposed to exist. By Wednesday, the hospital had issued a formal apology to Sarah Chen and reinstated her with back pay. By Friday, they'd offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. By the following Monday, she was implementing new billing oversight protocols and hiring 2 other veteran nurses who needed second chances. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her new office on the 4th floor. The tarnished challenge coin was displayed in a shadow box beside it, a photograph of 7-year-old Marcus Webb from Tikrit, his face streaked with dust and confusion, and beside that, a photograph of present-day Marcus in his army dress uniform, his expression the color of belonging. Marcus worked as a patient advocate at St. Michael's now, his sign language fluency teaching staff how to communicate with deaf and hard-of-hearing patients, his presence a daily reminder that the people labeled charity cases often carried the heaviest honors. One Tuesday afternoon in late spring, Sarah glimpsed through the parking lot window a graying man in an ill-fitting suit standing at a folding table outside the Walmart across the street. He was selling supplemental insurance policies. His hands moved through the stack mechanically, organizing brochures that most people didn't take. His eyes never met anyone's. His shoulders curved inward like a man trying to disappear into his own geography. Dr. Whitfield. Once powerful. Once dangerous. Now invisible in a different way, the way of the forgotten, the way of the man who'd built an empire on lies and watched it burn in 3 helicopters and a Navy Cross. Sarah watched for 10 seconds. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Not anger. She felt the way she'd always felt, steady, certain, unmoved by the chaos of smaller people making smaller choices. She returned to her desk and continued reviewing trauma protocols with her team. Emma, now 13, visited after school on Wednesday and found her mother in the office, studying deployment statistics from military medical units. The shadow box caught her eye immediately, the coin, the photographs, the history made visible. "Mom," Emma asked, sitting on the edge of the desk with the ease of a child who knew her mother's steady hands had held her through every difficult night, "do you ever regret hiding for so long?" Sarah considered the question. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She signed back even though Emma still didn't know ASL, her fingers shaping the words anyway, the muscle memory of a language she'd spoken in deserts and midnight corridors and evacuation helicopters. "I regret that it took crisis to surface, but I don't regret protecting you by staying invisible." That was a different kind of courage. She said aloud, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." Marcus entered for their weekly review meeting, saw mother and daughter together, and signed to both of them, "The bravest thing is knowing when to surface and when to dive." Nightingale 6 taught me that before I knew what it meant. The tarnished coin caught afternoon light streaming through the office window. Sarah's scars, no longer hidden under long sleeves, showed like badges earned in the longest war. The war of staying true when staying hidden felt safer. The war of choosing right over easy. The war of being invisible until the moment it mattered to be seen. Both of them were finally home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, if you've ever kept a secret that could change everything, if you've ever wondered what happens when hidden heroism meets institutional corruption, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of the people the world overlooked. Like and comment if you think Sarah Chen was justified in her silence, and tell us in the comments below, would you have done the same?